Hi everyone, and welcome to the Millennial Revolt, an independent political talk show that seeks to bring a different narrative than the stale one we have going on right now in the mainstream media. So today we're going to be talking about something important, something that the mainstream media isn't even touching, and something that I'm surprised that not too many alternative media outlets are even covering. During the lame duck session in Congress, the House passed Resolution 5732, or the Syria Civilian Protection Act, calling for intensifying the already harsh sanctions on Syria and imposing a no-fly zone inside Syria to prevent the Syrian government from flying within their own country, and escalating efforts to press criminal charges against Syrian officials. This is extremely dangerous, also given the fact that President-elect Trump hasn't decided on who he wants to put as Secretary of State. Now we know he has called for working with the Russian government. He does not want to engage in regime change, and he wants to work with the Russian government to defeat ISIS. But talk is cheap. Actions speak louder than words. If he picks John Bolton or if he picks Mitt Romney, it's game over for all of us. Nothing has changed. And it's extremely important that we pay attention to this and we hold his feet to the fire, because this is not a game. This is not a joke. This could lead to a world war. So there's so much to discuss, so let's just get right into it. Well, as we know, during the presidential debates, Hillary Clinton was openly calling for a no-fly zone in Syria. She had much of the Republican establishment behind her. She had most of the neocons openly supporting her. The military-industrial complex was openly supporting her as well. Now, we are in violation of two sections in the UN Charter. Paragraph 1. The organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. And the most important one, paragraph 4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. Now, we've seen what a no-fly zone did to Libya. Libya is now a haven for terrorist activities, which was one of the most richest countries in Africa. Now you have millions of people flowing into Europe. It's causing undue stress and chaos on the social fabric of many of these Western European countries. And US foreign policy plays a part in this, but Western Europe's foreign policy plays a part in this as well. You can't start destroying other people's nations and then not expect these people to come into your nations. And to begin with, these people are angry. You destroyed their homes, you took their livelihood away, and this is what you have. But I digress. House Resolution 5732, which is the Syrian Civilian Protection Act, claims to promote a negotiated settlement in Syria, but analyzed by Friends Committee for National Legislation, it imposes preconditions which would actually make the situation more difficult. There were 40 minutes of debate with 6 representatives: Royce, Engel, Roslektin, Kittle, Smith, and Curbelio, speaking in favor of the resolution. There were few other congressional representatives present in Congress, so there wasn't even a full session in Congress. There was no one who knew. This was basically done in secret. The House Foreign Affairs Committee stated that the resolution was passed unanimously without even mentioning what the special conditions were. In any case, the resolution calls for evaluating and developing plans for a no-fly zone, which is an act of war. And again, I bring this back and I keep drawing parallels. We've seen what a no-fly zone did to Libya. It destroys this country, but unfortunately, in this situation, it is extremely more dangerous. You have a superpower flying in the sky. You also have the Iranian government, which is allied with the Syrian government. That can also create another problem as well. This is obviously controversial, and it seems clear the resolution should have been debated and discussed under normal rules with a normal amount of congressional presence and debate, because something like this has devastating consequences for the population in the United States, in Russia, Syria, Iran, all over the globe. If you have the United States implementing a no-fly zone, are you saying that the United States government is prepared to shoot down Russian jets? Russia is not Iraq. They are not Afghanistan. They are not Libya. They will shoot back, and that will cause NATO to trigger our Article 5, and you have a full-blown situation right there. The motivation for bypassing normal rules and rushing the bill through without debate was articulated by the bill's author and ranking Democrat, Eliot Engel, who said, "We cannot delay action on Syria any further. If we don't get this legislation across the finish line in the next few weeks, we are back to square one." So in the last days of the Obama administration, you have warmongers on the right as well as on the left trying to escalate a situation that they will not be prepared to handle, because it's not their kids, it is not their family members who have to go out to fight in a war. God forbid this ever happens. It is us. It is the American people who have to pay the consequences for their actions that these jackasses are promoting. Suspension of rules procedure is supposed to be used for non-controversial bills, such as naming post offices, right? But this small group of lawmakers used it to pass a drastically important bill that will have lasting consequences if it is actually implemented. The blatant abuse of power shows the desperation of the neocons and neoliberals in the Congress. We already know that the military-industrial complex was backing Hillary. She said when she first took office that she would make Syria her priority, she said on national TV, and I've pointed this out many times in my videos, that she would implement a no-fly zone. There were members of Congress from the left and the right who were backing her. Now, we already know that Donald Trump has said, and this is the only thing that he has been consistent on, that he does not want to engage in regime change, that he wants to normalize ties and have good relations with Russia. Now, it is extremely important that he picks a Secretary of State who is on board with him, because we know Congress is trying to subvert whatever he is trying to do, from the left and the right. Like this is not a partisan issue. This is bipartisan. You have Democrats doing this and you have Republicans doing this. They are both trying to create a situation that they are not prepared for the consequences. Now, as far as Syria is concerned, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have the same end goal: regime change in Syria, partition of Syria, and arming rebels. Now, the neocons go about it in a whole different way. They go about it, we need troops on the ground, we need this. You've seen that's the Iraq, you've seen Afghanistan, that's what the neocons do. Now, the neoliberals do it in a way that's more, I think, more dangerous, where they say, well, we're going to help the people who are supposedly uprising on their own. Now, we know a lot of these uprisings have been influenced by our government. Now, they arm these people, or they implement their no-fly zones, and they bomb these people to existence, and then the people who we armed, these fundamentalist people, these neo-fascists themselves, these religious fascists, take over, then all hell breaks loose. We have beheadings, and we have people running for their lives, fleeing the country en masse. We've seen this happen. We've seen this over and over, and this is what upsets me about American foreign policy, because the establishment of both parties are in lockstep when it comes to regime change, when it comes to bombing countries out of existence. And then you wonder why we have problems with all of these countries in the Middle East. You can't keep claiming you're about to bring democracy to these people and do these for your own geostrategic political goals and then not expect blowback. It happens every single time. HR 5732, which is titled The Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act, Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Ed Royce, a Republican of California and also a co-sponsor of this bill, explained that the resolution is named after the brave Syrian defector known to the world as Caesar, who testified to us the shocking scale of torture being carried out within the prisons in Syria. In reality, the Syria story was a grand deception involving the CIA with funding from Qatar to sabotage the 2014 Geneva negotiations. Now, we know from WikiLeaks and the John Podesta emails that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were providing funding as well as logistical support to ISIS. We also know that Turkey, being a NATO ally and an ally to the US, never closed its border, which is bordering Syria, which allowed hundreds of thousands of militants to flow into that country. We also know that Turkey was buying oil from ISIS. The 55,000 photos, which were said to show 11,000 torture victims, have never been publicly revealed. Only a tiny number of those photos have been publicized. However, in 2015, Human Rights Watch was granted access to view the entire set. They revealed that almost one half of the photos showed the opposite of what they claimed. Instead of victims tortured by the Syrian government, they actually showed dead Syrian soldiers and civilian victims of car bombings and other terrorist attacks. The Caesar story, replete with the masked defector, was one of the early propaganda hoaxes regarding Syria. Now, if you remember the lead up to Libya, it was basically the same thing. Assad was cracking down on his people, and they were same thing they were saying Gaddafi cracked down on his people. The US went in, along with many other Western European countries. They also participated in this, the destruction of Libya. They put a no-fly zone, they bombed the country to hell, they armed rebels, they took out Gaddafi. The country went to hell. Now, this was the same formula that happened here, except the American people didn't fall for it. Now, one of the biggest lies regarding Syria is that the U.S. has been inactive, Royce says. He says that the administration has decided not to decide, and that itself, unfortunately, has set a course where here we sit and watch the violence only worsen. Mr. Speaker, America has been sitting back and watching these atrocities for far too long. Vital U.S. national security interests are at stake, and that's all that is. They want to tear Syria apart for the pipeline, to get their pipeline, and because they want to bypass Russia, and they don't want to use Russian gas because Russia supplies most of the gas to Europe. The ranking Democrat Elliot Engels said, 4 years ago, I thought we should have aided the Free Syrian Army, which is illegal under international law to providing arms to militants. They came to us in Washington and begged us for their help. They were simply looking for weaponry. I really believe if we had given it to them, the situation in Syria would have been different. The situation in Syria would have been exactly like Libya. We armed these people. They turned out to be neo-fascist, religious loonies who took over the country, and now it's a basket case. You have two rival governments fighting for power. You have ISIS, which has a stronghold in that country as well. It is a terrorist haven. This is what the United States does. We keep claiming that we're helping the civilians. You're killing the civilians, because before the civil war even started, Syria was in relative peace. They had no issues like this until we started backing militants and trying to engage in regime change. The U.S. was actively coordinating, training, and supplying armed opposition groups beginning in late 2011. When the Gaddafi government was toppled in the fall of 2011, the CIA oversaw the theft of the Libyan armories and shipments of weapons to the Syrian armed opposition, as documented in the Defense Intelligence Agency report of 2012. Now, if you remember that the UN Security Council, everyone voted to basically invade Libya. Russia abstained under the impression that this wasn't going to happen, that they weren't going to topple Gaddafi after he gave up his chemical weapons. Instead, they went in, they toppled the government, they overthrew it, they destroyed it. He died. They weren't about to let that happen with their ally, Syria has been their ally for decades. That is a part of the reason why they went in. These weapon transfers were secret. For public record, it was acknowledged that the U.S. was supplying communications equipment to the armed opposition while Saudi Arabia and Qatar were supplying weaponry. It is one reason that Saudi purchases of weapons skyrocketed during this time period. They were buying weapons to replace those being shipped to the armed opposition in Syria. It was very profitable for the U.S. arms manufacturers. Huge weapon transfers to the armed oppositions in Syria have continued to this day. This past spring, Jane Defense reported the details of the U.S. delivering 2.2 million pounds of ammunition, rocket launchers, and other weaponry to the armed opposition. Claims that the U.S. have been inactive are false. In reality, the U.S. has been doing everything short of a directed attack on Syria and Bashar al-Assad itself, and the U.S. military is starting to cross that line. On September 17th, the U.S. air coalition directly attacked the Syrian army in Deir ez-Zor, killing 80 Syrian soldiers and enabling ISIS to launch an attack on the Syrian army's position. They claimed it was a mistake, but I doubt it. The claims by Congressional hawks that the U.S. has been inactive in the Syrian conflict are part of the false narrative suggesting that the U.S. has to do something, which leads to a no-fly zone and eventually a full-scale war. Now, if you are paying attention to what's happening in the European Union as well, they just voted saying that RT and Russia was on the same par as ISIS, basically Russian propaganda, and that we are at war with Russia. Ironically, these calls for war are masked as humanitarian. Now, these are the humanitarian bombers saying we're going to go help everybody, but we're destroying your nation in the process. And they never do these proponents bring up the case of Libya, where the US and NATO did something. They destroyed the government and left chaos in its process. During the 40-minute debate, where 6 lawmakers pushed this bill through, they claimed that the Obama administration had been sitting back and doing nothing as the violence worsens, and the Assad regime, as they call it, was killing millions of his civilians. And as we know, this is false. Credible estimates of casualties in the Syrian conflict range from 300,000 to 420,000. The opposition supporting Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates the documented 2011 to 2016 death toll as follows. Killed pro-Syrian forces are 108,000, killed anti-government forces are 105,000, and killed civilians are 89,000. In contrast with the Congressional and media claims, civilians comprise a minority of the total death counts. Against the largest casualty group is those fighting in defense of the Syrian state, which is the Syrian army and people who are arming themselves to protect their country and fight for their country, to not let it fall in the hands of terrorists. These facts are ignored and never mentioned because they point to reality versus the propaganda narrative, which allows the U.S. and its allies to continue funding terrorism and a war of aggression against Syria. The Congressional speakers were in full self-righteous mode as they accused the Syrian government of committing crimes against humanity and war crimes against civilians, including murder, torture, and rape. No one has been spared from this targeting, even children. A naive listener would never know that the Syrian government is primarily fighting the Syrian branch of Al-Qaeda, including thousands of foreigners supplied and paid by foreign governments. Again, as we know from WikiLeaks, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are providing funding as well as logistical support to many terrorist groups within Syria, ISIS included. The Congressional speakers go on to accuse the Syrian military of targeting hospitals, schools, and markets. A critical listener might ask why they would do that instead of targeting Al-Qaeda terrorists and their allies who launched dozens and sometimes hundreds of Hellcat missiles into government-held Aleppo every day. The congressional propaganda would not be complete without mention of the white helmets. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce said, "We previously heard testimony of Ray Salih of the Syrian white helmets. These are the doctors, nurses, and volunteers who actually, when the bombs come, run toward the areas that have been hit in order to try to get the injured civilians medical treatment. They have lost over 600 doctors and nurses. This is more congressional nonsense. There are no nurses or doctors associated with the White Helmets. The organization was created by the US and the UK and heavily promoted by a shady PR firm. The White Helmets operates solely in areas controlled by al-Nusra, an associated terrorist group. They do some rescue work in the conflict zone, but their main role is in the information war manipulating public opinion. The White Helmets actively promote US NATO intervention through a no-fly zone. Recently, the White Helmets have become a major source of claims of innocent civilian victims in East Aleppo. Given the clear history of the White Helmets, these claims should be treated with skepticism. What exactly is their evidence? The same skepticism needs to be applied to a video and other reports from the Aleppo Medical Center, AMC, is a creation of the Syrian Exasperates organization whose address on K Street, Washington, D.C. indicates it is a U.S. marketing firm. The campaign to overthrow the Syrian government is failing, and there is a possibility of victory for the Syrian government and its allies. The previous flood of international jihadi recruits have dried up. The Syrian army and its allies are gaining ground militarily. And if Russia and the Syrian army, as well as the Syrian government and Iran, was to push back the terrorists in Aleppo and then take out ISIS in Raqqa, it would be seen as a middle finger in the face of the United States as well as its Western allies, because they did in less than a year what the US and its Western coalition could not do. They were a bit too busy bombing Syrian infrastructure to actually take out ISIS and the other terrorist-affiliated groups in that country. There's even been reports that pro-Israel groups have been major campaigners for the passage of H.R. 5732. The name of Simon Wiesenthal is even involved in the resolution. Israel interests are one of the primary forces sustaining and promoting the conflict. Syria is officially at war with Israel, which continues to occupy the Syrian Golan Heights. Syria has been a key ally of the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah, and Syria has maintained its alliance with Iran. In 2010, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton urged Syria to break relations with Hezbollah, reduce relations with Iran, and come to a settlement with Israel. The Syrian refusal to comply with these Washington demands was instrumental in solidifying Washington hostilities. Congressional proponents of H.R. 5732 made clear the international dimensions of the conflict. Royce explains it is Russia, it is Hezbollah that are the primary movers of death and destruction. It is the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, fighters from Iran. Engel echoed the same message. He said, "Yes, we want to go after Assad's partners in violence, along with Iranian and Hezbollah forces." These statements are in contrast with the analysis of some writers who believe Israel is not deeply opposed to the Damascus government. For example, Phyllis Bennis recently wrote that belief in an arc of resistance has been long debunked, and that the Syrian regime often plays a useful role for US and Israeli interests. Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren explained in an interview that we always wanted President Bashar al-Assad to go. We always preferred the bad guys who aren't backed by Iran to bad guys who are backed by Iran. The greater danger to Israel is by the strategic arc that extends from Tehran, Damascus to Beirut, and we saw the Assad regime as the keystone in that arc. These statements have been fully backed up by Israel's actions, bombing Syrian positions in southern Syria and providing medical treatment to al-Nusra and other armed opposition groups in the Golan Heights. So, with the passing of H.R. 5732, how it was rushed and how it was put through, it tells us a couple of things. One, that people in Congress and the people in the US government who are proponents of regime change have not given up on their war in Syria. Two, they are looking to escalate tensions with Russia. Three, that Congress has become a place where blatant lies are said with impunity behind cynical and crocodile tears of humanitarianism. And the last point, but I think which is the most important, that it is incumbent upon us to hold Donald Trump's feet to the fire, whoever he picks for his Secretary of State. Because if you have people doing this before he has even taken the oath of office, imagine what they will do when he is actually sworn in. We have a Republican Congress. Not too sure that these people are not trying to engage in regime change. You see it played out on Fox News, them crying their crocodile tears, saying, "Oh well, the Syrian regime keeps advancing, and they're bombing their own people." You see it on MSNBC, you see it on CNN, you see it in our newspapers. On the left, they're saying, "Oh well, the children of Aleppo. We need to go help the children." So it is incumbent upon us to stay vigilant, to be aware of the situation. And I'm going to leave you guys with a quote that I think is extremely fitting. Mankind has put an end to war before war puts an end to mankind. Our former president, John F. Kennedy. I'm the Millennial Revolt. You have a wonderful day. Bye.